The great diversity in the geography of what we know today as British Columbia led to an equally great diversity of First Nations society, each with a unique identity and relationship to the land. The province can be divided into 4 regions according to the topography, climate, and vegetation. The coast, southern interior, northern interior, and northeast. The coast, with its wet, mild climate, is characterized by many inlets and passages bounded by steep mountains and valleys flanked with lush temperate rainforests. The southern interior, the hottest region of the province, is built from a series of parallel mountain ranges, lakes, and plateaus laced with a network of interconnecting rivers, which equally forms the Fraser and Columbia River. The northern interior, the largest region, has a subarctic climate with broad expansions of boreal forest clothing its plateaus and mountains. The northeast is the only region of the province east of the continental divide, meaning its rivers, including the Peace River, drain into the Arctic Ocean. The First Nations of British Columbia have always had a special relationship with the land, which is marked by respect. It reflects a different worldview from the Western European cultures on the seas and the natural world. Technologies were developed to efficiently and effectively harvest and process the plants and animals which make up the natural resources. Interior people had relatively large and open areas within the territories and traveled efficiently to reach different sites. First Nations group used surplus resources to trade with other nations. Vast trading networks were established for thousands of years. Because Uluchin grease was one of the most valuable resources carried on these trails, they were often referred to as grease trails. Europeans came to the west coast in the 1700s, hundreds of years after the first contact occurred in Canada. The search for the Northeast Passage to provide easier access to Asia brought the first ships to the Pacific coast. However, devastating effects of smallpox and other diseases obliterated. As many as 90% of the Aboriginal population died in the period of a few decades. During much of the fur trade era, First Nations people had to deal with just one corporate entity, the Hudson's Bay Company. But the discovery of gold brought tens of thousands of newcomers into British Columbia, each concerned only with his own wealth. The Indian Act was passed in 1876, effectively taking control of many aspects of their lives away from First Nations individuals and communities. They were restricted to small fragments of their former territories by the potlatch, and many of their children were taken away to residential schools. The damage of families and communities has lasted for several generations, and First Nations are still in the process of healing from the devastation. Ironically, Treaty 8 was signed with the First Nations of northeastern BC. Until 1911, most residence was undertaken by individual groups, but that year in Victoria, the beginning of an unfair protest movement began when many First Nations gathered to protest a petition to Premier Richard McBride.
First Nations people were the backbone of the fishing industry. Their traditional skills were applied in the harvesting and processing of salmon resources, but not in its management. First Nations people became involved in 3 ways: subsistence farming, commercial farming, and as farming laborers.
The McKenna-McBride Commission of 1912 to 1916 was expected to provide the final solution to the Indian problem by creating additional reserves and extinguishing Aboriginal title in the process. The potlatch laws were prosecuted with renewed force when participants in a great potlatch in Kwakwaka'wakw territory were sent to prison as much of their ceremonial regalia was confiscated.
A new organization, the Native Brotherhood of British Columbia, emerged in the 1930s, and by the 1940s had become an important voice in bringing about change to the basic human rights. White Paper of 1969, which sought to abolish the Indian Act and not replace it with anything that recognized and protected Aboriginal rights. George Manuel and Frank Calder took up the reins from the great leaders of the first half of the century. Section 35 of the Constitution Act BOW recognized and affirms existing Aboriginals and treaty rights and defines Aboriginal people as including Indian, Inuit, and Métis people of Canada. A number of cases from BC have become landmark cases in defining Aboriginal rights, including Gixan, Sparrow, and Vanderpeet. Epidemics of the 18th and 19th century, which destroyed as much as 90% of the First Nations population in BC, have given way to equally disturbing but more chronic health issues. Families have suffered on another front, that of the government intervention. It is response to family breakdowns. Child welfare agencies pursued policies which removed children not only from their homes but also from their communities, with devastating effects.
The end. Bye, Bryce. Alejandra.
Blair and Randy.
Taylor.